Morning.
No, no tanto.
Good morning. I'm Peter Schechter. I'm the director of the Adrian Arch Latin America Center, and on behalf of all of my colleagues here at the Atlantic Council, I want to welcome you this morning. We're very, very pleased to have you for this fascinating event, and I want to start off by thanking the Skoll Foundation for sponsoring the event and all of our appreciation to the Social Progress Imperative, to Agora Partnership, and Chemonics for partnering with us today. Bretton Woods, a small town in New Hampshire, gave birth to a lot of things which are important here in Washington today. There's the World Bank and the IMF. They were Bretton Woods creations. There's a big 18-hole golf course on the outskirts of Washington, D.C. that's called Bretton Woods. But importantly for this morning, it was after Bretton Woods in 1944 that GDP became the main, sometimes the only, tool for measuring a country's economy. Now, at about that precise moment in 1944, Pan Am's DC-4 was crossing the Atlantic in 17 hours. Needless to say, the world has updated, yet the single-minded focus on GDP as the sole economic measurement of national development has not. And that means we've not adequately found a way to measure people's well-being until 2 years ago. The Social Progress Index has since then become a disruptive force and has helped reshape the discussion about national well-being. Recently, Paraguay, whose minister is with us today, has decided to adopt the index at a national level. Other countries, such as Costa Rica, are strongly considering doing the same. There's been a growing movement, both bottom-up and top-down, to redefine the measurements of development. And one of the main questions is, what do we do with GDP? Many believe it must become a complementary metric. Social progress and environmental outcomes, on the other hand, have gained momentum and seem more telling of our country's health, well-being, and progress. For us who follow Latin America, a region where 75 million people came out of poverty in the last decade, the ability to measure social progress provides us with a key understanding of the interaction between citizens and governments, even in downtimes like these. So this is just a glimpse of what the Social Progress Index shows us. The SPI will serve as a backbone to our conversation today, but I leave it to our experts to put flesh on the bone. And we have a unique group of experts. Jose Molinas is the Minister of Planning for Paraguay. Matthew Bishop is the senior editor of The Economist and co-founder of the Social Progress Index. Marcela Escobari is the executive director of Harvard University's Center for International Development. And Raul Gatica is a senior director of Latin American Government Affairs at Abbott. This is a great group to discuss this important subject. And as we think about measuring a nation's development and social progress, we're lucky to start this conversation with a professional who's uniquely qualified to frame the coming discussion. Julie Katzmann is a woman of many hats. She's Executive Vice President and Chief Operating Officer of the Inter-American Development Bank, which she joined in 2009 as manager of the Multilateral Investment Fund. Since her appointment as Executive VP, Julie has helped transform the bank and has focused on multi-sectoral dimensions of development challenges. Ms. Katzmann has also been an ardent proponent of women's economic empowerment agendas. This year, she was named one of the top 50 businesswomen in Latin America by the Latin Trade magazine, and one of the top 10 influential women in global diversity by Diversity Global magazine. She's going to speak for a few minutes, and generously, she's agreed to take some questions at the end. After Julie speaks, the center's deputy director, Jason Marzak, will introduce our panel in greater length and captain the rest of the discussion. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Julie Katzmann. Thanks for being with us today.
Well, thank you, Peter. And I have to say that it is really heartening to look out and see so many people who are interested in talking about progress in a much more nuanced way that, as Peter said, we've been doing for so long. The IDB certainly thinks about progress in a much broader way. Sure, economic growth is without a doubt important and essential, but we consider our mission to be that of improving lives. And to us, what does that mean? Well, it means increasing access to quality basic services and increasing the sustainability of cities and countries, increasing the level of social inclusion in a society. And at the end of it all, being able to have the expectation that one's children will have a better life than you have had yourself. And so we think of that really as social progress. Now, it's easy to see, I think, to all of us that neither GDP nor the Gini coefficient are good enough. They really don't tell us where countries and how countries are succeeding, and if and who is being left behind. And is a country planting the seeds today and tending them properly to ensure that people will have not only a prosperous future, but a future filled with well-being? So it's clear that there are other tools that are needed. And actually, you can go back to 1972, I think it is, when the fourth Dragon King of Bhutan, one of the great titles out there in the world, started talking about gross national happiness. I think it's important to keep in mind that there is no index that's perfect, and that in general, when you create something, it gets better over time as people use it. We have a fair amount of experience with this at the IDB because sometimes people have reacted pretty badly when we first started these things. But over time, they've really proven their worth. I'm sure that everybody here knows that the Social Progress Index is built on three basic pillars. The first being basic human needs, the second being foundations of well-being, and the third, opportunity. Now, when any of these indices come out, I, of course, go immediately to look at where the countries of Latin America and the Caribbean are rated, and I focus on those. And when first looking at the Social Progress Index, I think that as you look at Latin America as a whole in the index, it is indicative of the level of development in the region as a whole, because in fact you see that for most of the countries, the lowest score is on the opportunity side. And since most of the countries are now middle-income countries, you can see that that kind of has a basic sense to it. But similarly, I also tend to look at where are countries overperforming and underperforming relative to GDP. And I think that was a really good point Peter made, which is that it becomes, in this kind of context, something that is another dimension that lets you look at where things are falling. So it's really striking to see, okay, Uruguay is the #1 country in the index in the region, and it's 24th. Which is interesting because Uruguay's GDP per capita, $19,000, who's a couple rungs above it, France, surprisingly, and GDP per capita is $37,000. So you begin to sort of go, okay, now how do I compare them and what's driving this relative to that? Or, in another case, Costa Rica and South Korea. So Costa Rica is 28th, South Korea is 29th, and South Korea's GDP per capita is more than twice that of Costa Rica's. But then you say, okay, so what's really driving that performance? In both cases, the opportunity score is the lowest score. In Costa Rica's case, that's because of access to advanced education. In Korea's case, it's about tolerance and personal rights. There's a real difference there. Now, they both score well in the foundations of well-being, and in fact, Costa Rica scores higher than South Korea. But if you look at what happened in the last election, you might ask some questions about that, because many would say that the reason that those who were in government lost the election is because they were unable to transfer that score on foundations of well-being off the coast where tourist centers are and into the rest of the country. Or you look at Uruguay. That also scores and outscores Costa Rica in foundations of well-being, which includes access to basic education and access to secondary education. But Uruguay has the highest high school dropout rate in the region other than Guatemala. And they succeed in graduating only 15% of students from the lowest quartile and less than 60% of students from the highest quartile. So again, you sort of look at that and go, maybe there's something we need to dig into there. Or last, it's interesting to see how the scores in our region are so heavily affected by the really low scores in security in almost every country, and how other countries' scores are so much more heavily affected on the downside by the issues of tolerance and inclusion and personal rights. You get a good sense of region versus region when you look at all of this stuff. So I will say at the end of the day, though, for positives and negatives, I'm a big believer in rankings. And I'll tell a short story here, which is one of the first rankings that the IDB created was something called the microscope. And it ranked the enabling environment for microfinance in all the countries in the region. And about 5 years ago, at the big microfinance event, before the day kicked off, there was the launch of that year's microfinance microscope, and Argentina was ranked last. So the Minister of Finance was first up on the agenda that morning. And I suddenly see him off at the side, like scribbling away very frantically. And he gets up and he says, "I'd like to start with one comment. We will not be last next year." And it was a terrible microfinance environment. It's still not great, but they were not last. And they focused immediately after he spoke. He said, okay, what are the 3 things I have to do to get out from last? So I do think that rankings really can make a difference, and they really can drive behavior because we're so competitive as human beings that we just don't want to be last, or in fact, we most of the time really want to be first. So while I think that we'll see the index continue to improve over time, and we'll be able to draw more and more conclusions, it's a really important tool for us to begin to apply across the board. I hope that there will be more subnationals, more Detroits, more Californias, more cities like the 10 in Colombia who will be adopting the index, or the regions, the neighborhoods in Bogota, so that policymakers can use this to focus public policy, so that societies really can improve, so that opportunities can increase, and so that we really can change lives, which is what we're ultimately all about. So thank you very much. And if anybody has anything they'd like to ask now, I'll do that now. Yes? And maybe if you'd introduce yourself at the start, that would be great.
Hello, my name is Jose Miguel Pulido. I work in Mitsui & Co. in the public affairs team. Thank you very much. I wanted to ask, are there any lessons that the private sector can take from this new index to sort of see how they should tackle an environment where they're going to make an investment decision? It seems that this is really focused for public sector, but seeing as how private sector is a huge actor in economic development in Latin America, it'd be interesting to hear your opinions. Thank you very much.
You bet. So, actually, I think if you look at the breakdown of the scores in the index, this depends on what part of the private sector you're in, but here are a couple of thoughts, okay? What jumps out at you as you look at certain countries is where government is not meeting the needs of the population. So from a private sector perspective, in a way, it's a reverse roadmap to say, opportunity for the private sector. If you look at Peru and you see the score on basic education, in effect, you can see why there is a very successful business person who's created a very successful private school alternative for the emerging middle class. Right? I mean, the 60 or 75 million people who've left poverty, the 100 million people who joined the middle class, all of whom are still vulnerable, but all of whom are incredibly focused on how do I create more opportunity for my kids. So I think that in many ways, it can create a roadmap for where government is not succeeding and where the private sector might fill in. And I'll pick another area within that, which is sustainability. I think that in many ways, in certain countries, this isn't only where government might be failing, but this is where the private sector is failing, because sustainability is very much a joint responsibility. Okay, time for the panel.
Thank you very much, Julie, for those excellent remarks to start the discussion, Mister. I think you've already started to do half the job of the panel, and insofar as laying out some of the main points of the index and some of Matthew's job as well. I'm Jason Marzek. I'm the Deputy Director of the Adrian Arsh Latin America Center, and I'm delighted to be moderating our discussion today on a topic that frankly doesn't get the attention that it deserves. As Peter said at the beginning, there's increasingly clear consensus that economic growth is a far from complete way to measure how well a country and its people are doing, but it's really difficult to come up with proxies for economic growth or to do it in a way that can be broadly applied and used across countries. And so one of the biggest struggles is really to pull up and think about progress. How are we thinking about it? What are the components behind it? And how does that affect public policy as well? And I think there are few places as important as Washington to do this. So when we met with the folks from the Social Progress Imperative a little less than a year ago, one of our first thoughts was we need to talk about this index and what it means among Washington stakeholders. And that's what we're here to do this morning. It's a typical light Friday morning at the Atlantic Council where we're talking about Gini coefficients, among other things. But this topic is especially relevant for us at the Adrienne Arch Latin America Center, since it builds on the basic concepts of the work we've done over the last year on social entrepreneurship and linking public good to private action, including a report we released in May with our senior fellow Gabrielle Zinni on harnessing social impact investing, and August spotlight we did on social entrepreneurship. So I'm thrilled that we're joined here today by such a distinguished panel to think further about this topic. You have their full bios, but I will briefly go over them. To my left is Jose Molinas. Jose is the Minister of Planning for Paraguay. The minister became minister just over 2 years ago, but is no stranger to Washington, having spent 8 years at the World Bank here, and in addition to working at the World Bank, is also has a career as an academic as well as a professor at the Catholic University in Asuncion. Next to Jose is Marcela Escobardi. Marcela is the executive director of Harvard University Center for International Development. She has deep experience in a number of areas, including working really at the nexus of business and development, and has advised governments on how to harness the private sector to eradicate poverty. Next to her is Raul Gatica. Raul is the Senior Director for Latin America Government Affairs and Policy at the well-known global healthcare company Abbott. Abbott's headquartered in Chicago, but Raul did not come here from Chicago. Raul came up from Buenos Aires for this panel. Raul has over 25 years across industries, from think tanks to the public sector and multinational corporations. And next to Raul is Matthew Bishop. Matthew is, yes, he's the senior editor for The Economist, but more importantly for today's discussion, he is the co-founder and a member of the board of directors of the Social Progress Index. This was Matthew's idea with Michael Porter, correct, Matthew? He is also the founder of, which I didn't realize until reading his bio, he's the founder of the Giving Tuesday campaign, which for those who don't know, Matthew, I'm going to put a plug in. The Giving Tuesday campaign is a global day of giving on the first Tuesday after Thanksgiving. So this year, Giving Tuesday is December 1st, right, Matthew? So hashtag Giving Tuesday. He is also the author of several books with Michael Green, who is the executive director of the Social Progress Imperative. I want to remind everyone that, yes, it's okay to tweet about what's being said, but if you're going to do that, please use the hashtag ACProgress. We're going to have a conversation here, try and keep as fluid as possible, and then we're going to leave time for questions and answers at the end. To start our conversation, though, and we're going to have short answers, but Matthew, a longer answer in the beginning. Julie already previewed for you some of the findings of the Social Progress Index. But if you could start and explain a little bit about why the Social Progress Imperative decided to start the index, and also if you give a little overview of not only its 3 dimensions, but also how you decided what would be those 12 components under each of those dimensions.
Yeah, well, firstly, thanks for the Atlantic Council for hosting this. I've sort of known Fred Kemp for many years, and it's great to see that what was an organisation that had, maybe was seen as having had better days, has really now become exactly what was needed, which is a really robust think tank, really looking at every aspect of this important foreign policy Atlantic debate that's going on. So it's great that you're taking on this issue as well. I love Julie's remarks because they reflect exactly what we hoped for when the index was dreamed up, which is to have a conversation about social progress within a common framework where most people agree about the key components. The idea actually originated in a discussion in Dubai, hosted by the World Economic Forum, which has set up a bunch of things called Global Agenda Councils. And I chaired one on social innovation that was largely made up of social entrepreneurs. And our task was to come up with an idea that would have global impact. And most of the social entrepreneurs sitting there said, well, we really feel very much we're working away in our national or local context, and there is no framework by which we can have a global conversation about what's working and what isn't working. And being the World Economic Forum, we looked at the Global Competitiveness Index and looked at how over a period of a couple of decades, that index had not only evolved considerably, as Julie said, as people got better data, but had actually stimulated this extraordinary conversation at a political level where governments really cared where they appeared on the rankings, and they wanted to get themselves up those rankings. And we wondered, particularly as at a time when big questions were being asked about the usefulness of GDP, or certainly there was a growing awareness of the limitations of the GDP as a guide to whether your society is getting better, particularly after the 2008 crash. Could we actually create a comparative benchmark where people were competing to deliver better social outcomes for their society? And so the World Economic Forum didn't want any of these global agenda councils to incur any expense for the World Economic Forum or any additional responsibilities of the World Economic Forum. And so it was very much, the idea was that if you have this idea, go out and make it happen. And so with other members of the group, included people from Avena and Skoll, and we went out and raised some money after a lot of consultation where it seemed that what was within our group clearly a demand, that demand was pretty broad-based, that people were unhappy with I think the Human Development Index was seen as better than GDP, but actually highly correlated with GDP and not very good on sustainability. We reached out to other people who were looking at the happiness measures, which again were interesting, but not really comprehensive or granular enough to actually be useful for that kind of competitiveness to take place. And we raised a lot of money, and we brought Michael Porter in and Scott Stern to provide real econometric rigor, and we had advisors like Hernando de Soto also brought in to give us some input. We also talked to people like Jeff Sachs and Javier Martin Salai, who's been in charge of the competitiveness index at the forum, and people involved in some of the alternative measures of poverty as well. And generally, we came up with this three-pillar approach that each pillar has 4 subcomponents, and that seemed to meet most people's sense of what does the good society look like, the well-functioning society look like. If it scores well on all 3 of those pillars and all 4 subcomponents, then that society would be doing very well by its citizens. And we then went out and looked at all the vast amounts of data that existed, trying to find at a national level where we had good enough data to make a meaningful comparison. And I would say, in the spirit of Julie's comments, that the quality of data is pretty uneven in certain areas. And I think one of the big challenges we're going to take on over the next few years is, can we be more effective in harnessing private sector data, such as is produced by Google and Facebook and mobile phone companies, to actually accelerate the improvement in the quality of data on the ground, particularly in developing economies. But we basically agreed we found enough data to make what we felt were good first starts on each of those areas. And so the index went out at a national level 2 years ago for a small subset and for 140 countries last year and this year. And what's been interesting for me particularly is that what we initially saw as being a national competition between countries, we're actually seeing some of the fastest adoption at a city and regional level, particularly in Latin America, but not exclusively so. The European Union Commission has just published a study of all the regions in the European Union, which it's going to use to inform its solidarity and resilience budgets.
Matthew, I assume just jumping, I assume there was some debate on should these be the 3 components, should these be the 12 dimensions? Can you explain a little bit if, what type
Yeah, I
of
mean, I
internal
think there was
discussion
some
were-
debate, but there was definitely a sense that if you look at Human Development Index in particular, it was very good for countries coming from from low levels of development to medium levels of development, but it wasn't very useful once you started to go into the middle levels and towards higher levels of development. And so we felt that the 3 stages approach probably better fit the path of development in most countries. Now, we're not saying that they're sequential. There's quite a lot of overlap and so forth, but it felt like there was basic needs. There's something, as you move up the Maslow hierarchy or whatever, you get, you want higher degrees of quality of living and so forth. And then this whole area of opportunity and freedom got into this very important issue around rights. And, we're seeing some of the most interesting findings around sort of LGBT rights, women's empowerment, and so forth that weren't really being picked up in some of the other indices either.
Yeah, I was particularly struck by LGBT and other things being a part of the index, which I think is very forward-looking. Minister Molinas, Paraguay is a pioneer in its nationwide acceptance of the Social Progress Index. What pushed your and I think you in particular have been a pioneer insofar as pushing the importance of not only the Social Progress Index but the basic tenets behind the index. What were some of the motivating factors behind Paraguay really being one of the leaders in Latin America and frankly the world insofar as embracing this methodology?
Yeah, thank you very much, Jason, for the invitation to this panel. And to answer your question, it's important to see that Paraguay is a young democracy. Starting in 1989. We have ended more than 3 decades of dictatorship. And when people start expressing themselves, expressing their preference in the country, it was very clear that the emphasis was to live better. And that implied to have a very important social agenda. That was expressed with a lot of clarity in our 1992 Constitution. Mm-hmm. And in this democratic context, the country was learning, and is still learning, by doing, how to put the social progress agenda at the center of government, business, and civil society. And also how to start working together towards that end. In this context of social preferences and increasing importance of the social agenda, when we learn about the Social Progress Index, a coherent framework and a well-structured way to monitor progress, that create a lot of synergy with the moment of the country.
Yeah.
And the Social Progress Index contributed to this process of putting at the center the social agenda in many different ways. One important way was to contribute to have a shared vision for 2030, and also to have consensus, objectives, and strategic lines within the National Development Plan for 2030, to create also a council, a more structured council between government, private sector, and civil society leaders that takes this medium-term development framework and work on promoting the social progress agenda and also start guiding the national resources through the national budget to be aligned to this vision and to this strategic line of the National Development Plan. And equally important, to have a concrete way of monitor progress that at a different level of the policy cycle, at the input level, at the output level, and at the outcomes level, which is the emphasis in the Social Progress Index.
Yeah. And I mean, I think this is probably a best case scenario when Matthew and the others were thinking about the index, is let's actually use this for governments to think about their future plans, not only their plans, but I think incredibly importantly how they actually resource allocation along some of those different lines. Marcelo, you've spoken about issues of technology, entrepreneurship, and competitiveness in a wide range of different forms. What do you see as the key contributions of the Social Progress Index, especially looking even more broadly to the development agenda overall? How do you see the index really affecting the agenda. And also, you know, I asked Matt about the 12 components and the 3 dimensions of it. Would you suggest other components?
No, I mean, I think it's an extremely valuable contribution, right? And for the things that Julie said, people, everybody, governments, businesses, they manage what they measure. And if what we really want to create is a better society that meets human needs, that provides opportunities, that is sustainable, then we got to try to measure those things, right? GDP was meant to be a measure of output, not welfare, but because it was kind of, you know, widely used and remotely consistently applied, it became a very useful measure, and it was used for these purposes. The problem is that this is hard, right, to measure this, and which doesn't mean we shouldn't try. And I think what I value of this index is that, you know, you guys have put a stake on the ground on this is the way we're going to define it, and it opens the conversation as to, you know, these are pretty good, but these are going to evolve, and I think that's important. And I think the other valuable thing is that it allows countries to benchmark, right, and in the most disaggregated way, probably the most useful way. I mean, the indexes that Julie was talking about, it allows a country to say, you know, for this level of GDP, compared to my peers, you know, I'm doing pretty well on sustainability, but pretty lousy on gender parity. Okay, gives me an area to focus, and I think that's extremely valuable. I think we still have the challenge to understanding many of these issues and what's the theory of change behind each of these categories, but I think it opens that conversation.
Would there be other components that you would suggest to look at?
I think, like I said, I think this is a good start. There are others. The way that we are thinking about inclusive growth is moving to this definition of trying to include people into networks of opportunity, and I think trying to measure that inclusion. With the kind of data that you were talking about is going to become a very interesting frontier.
Yeah. Well, I would love to pick up on the question. There was a question for Julie about the private sector.
Yes,
and I'd love to pick up on that question with you and how a company like Abbott, how important are indices like this in making decisions of how much the private sector look at it and how much are these important for business?
I will answer your question, but I'd like to be a little bit provocative.
Please do.
Bringing the perspective from the private sector, because here is key, the commitment of the behavior from the policy decision makers. There is not perfect index, but as Julie mentioned, when the Ministry of Finance saw a very tough figure and said, oh, I will change this, it's a personal commitment. It's a commitment from the government to change. If we are not seeing this commitment, if we are not seeing the rule of law necessary, private sector, there is not been a contributor to improve the opportunity.
Yeah.
We have the commitment to improve the quality of the life of the people in our region. But from my personal view, those are the 2 key pillars to move ahead and take advantage of the opportunities that the index can bring us.
Yeah.
In our experience working in Latin America, we try to leverage those opportunities. We believe that there is critical areas where the public sector can contribute, are in the healthcare, in the judicial, education, but private sector can bring their experience, their investment to develop those areas, to contribute to improve the quality of life of the people in this. Through the private-public partnership, contributing to inclusion of the people, to improve with governance, to avoid corruption or lack of transparency, and bring more investment to improve the quality of technology or the education of the people.
And how does the business community, how much do you look at, you look at this index, you look at how governments are benchmarking within it, and is this helping, index like this helping to make investment decisions from Abbott?
Definitely, it's a complex matrix that we take into account to define where are the opportunities to contribute to improve the development of the societies. Because when we are seeing basic health needs not with the solution from the public sector, we bring the opportunity to work together to improve these areas. When we saw the opportunity to contribute to education of the physicians, or to improve the quality of the research that those people has, or how we can contribute with, IDB has been instrumental in Latin America to improve the infrastructure. But with one shot of vaccines, we can move fast to protect those population when investing in infrastructure take a long time and a lot of money. So those are the areas that we definitely we are seeing areas of opportunities, and the index brings a good information for us.
Matthew, one of the things that I thought was incredibly helpful in looking at the index, and Julie mentioned this in her opening comments, is how the index groups underperformers and overperformers with similar levels of GDP. I think that's incredibly interesting because the index is a complement to looking at GDP. And I think in looking at that, I was struck by the fact that Nicaragua, the second poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, is an overperformer in the index. In fact, it joins Costa Rica and Uruguay as 3 of the top 4 overperformers in the entire world on the index when you compare it to GDP levels. But then there's wealthier nations like the United States, France, or even Israel that are underperformers. So how do you explain this? How do you explain that? Is it just a mere fact that the wealthier countries have a greater amount of GDP and therefore don't allocate it to other resources rather than social progress?
Well, I mean, I think in a way it reinforces the reason, the validity of the reason why we did this index, because it shows that GDP is not the be-all and end-all, that you can have very similar levels of GDP and vastly different social progress outcomes. And what we're hoping to do with this index is to create new peer groups in a way that one of the if you actually take, as we've done, just the outcomes, the social outcomes, and then you compare them with GDP measures, you actually find really the policy matters, but also culture matters. I think one of the things with Nicaragua is a very strong family culture that seems to reflect there's sort of inherent welfare support for, in some ways, for the population that's been quite helpful, I think, in surviving the revolutions and upheavals and things over the years and coming through despite relatively weak economy. But Deloitte, who's one of the partners in the project, has done a very interesting analysis of the UN Global Development Goals that have just been adopted and used the US government's main global economic forecast for the next 15 years. And if you just simply rely on the forecast for GDP growth, and obviously that is a fiction, but it's the best we've got, over the next 15 years, simply on existing policies, we barely move the needle globally on social progress. So we don't get anywhere near to achieving the global development goals. But yet if we were to move towards whatever magic formula it is that, say, Costa Rica has, and we're able to spread that to countries that don't have that magic formula, then that combined with the kind of forecast GDP growth we're talking about would comfortably see us achieve the global development goals. And so there's a tremendous amount to play for. And I think these peer comparisons, I mean, comparing Uruguay and France, I mean, who would have done that before? But what an interesting question. And I think one of the things we're also going to, I'm also wondering is, we have these countries like Norway and the Scandinavian countries at the top of the list at the moment, but they're incredibly homogenous populations. And you start to wonder, they're now starting to experience significant migration. Europe, we all know about what's going on in the European Union regarding that. Does that start to undermine their particular models of social progress in ways that we'll see them not do so well in the list in 10 or 15 years' time? So there's all sorts of really fascinating questions that we can start to delve into. Now we have this common framework of analysis.
Yeah. Marcelo?
One point on this, and as we think about this, secret sauce of Costa Rica, or the total number, right? What does it mean that Nicaragua is better than France on this? I think it's important to ask these questions because there's something that these countries are doing right. But in a way, and I totally agree that the index in itself allows people to compete. So having a whole number is very valuable just to get it out there and get people, their competitive juices going. but they're not substitutes, right? All of these things. So being able to say, oh yeah, we did, and they don't all cost the same, right? So to say, okay, Costa Rica's doing great in education, but maybe not so much on, and yet it might get a higher number because it has done a couple things really well. When you put them together, because these are not substitutes, you might get an uneven picture of whether this country is really doing great, right? So that's something I think where most of the value comes is as you disaggregate it, because not only are they not substitutes, but sometimes they're complementary, right? Which are hopefully interesting conversations that come from this. Like, if you have education, then it makes a lot of these other things possible. Or if you have X, then that's the binding constraint for having social progress on a bunch of different things. What things can money buy and what things can't money buy? And I think that can happen when you disaggregate and see what the comparisons are.
Mr. Belize?
Two quick things to add on that. I mean, I think one is that when you start to break down within the country, comparing cities or regions, you're getting even more interesting comparisons in a way because you're getting much more similar entities. And so I'm very excited, for example, I mean, it looks like the Bay Area in California is going to break itself into 6 regions for the purposes of Social Progress Index and really compare how different parts of that that area work. And I think we're about to, I'm going to Bogota in a couple of weeks' time to talk about the Colombian Cities Index, which we actually have calculated back to 2009, so for the 10 biggest cities in Colombia. And now we're going to have a very interesting conversation with the new mayor of Bogota, and hopefully this will have a big impact on his strategy for the city. The other thing is on the private sector front, we've also found, again in Latin America, which has really been in many ways the pioneer for a lot of what we've been doing with Social Progress Index, both Coca-Cola and Natura in Brazil have been using Social Progress Index to try and examine their strategies around corporate citizenship and social responsibility. Where can they have the biggest impact in the communities where they're based? So I think there starts to be a private sector element there as well.
Raul, you want to jump in? Then
Yes, I'd like to ask a question to Minister, because it's interesting to learn how the policy decision makers take into account the index to develop the public agenda, to understand the priorities, because from the private sector, we can use those indicators just to promote the discussion, because we are seeing the opportunities, we're seeing how we can contribute to improve. But how the public sector use the index to build the agenda?
Great. And actually, I would like to come back also in answering your question to the performance over performance issue. I think that when we talk about performing, overperforming, or underperforming, we are talking about the relationship between the Social Progress Index to GDP. But that is only a portion of the picture. So we need, as Marcela has mentioned, we need to have a clearer idea of what drives change, or what, as the economy says, what is the production function of social progress. Definitely one element, an important element, are economic resources. But there are other types of resources which are very important, like the incentive to policymakers, the trust that can be generated in society that we usually call the social capital, the monitoring system that we put in place to see whether what we planned is being effectively taken to the ground, and also what are the incentive for rewarding or punishing the public officials, and keeping scores is a very effective one, as Julie has already mentioned. So, and I think if we start taking those elements that we need to create trust, and a way to create trust is to have a common vision of the society, and the Social Progress Index can contribute to that. We need to create trust also by working together from different sectors, from the private sector, from the government, and from the academia, and civil society. And having a common set of goals and a way to monitor facilitate this working together, and facilitates also the co-production from the public sector, the private and civil society. Innovation also is fostering by working with the academia, the private sector, and the government. And having that framework facilitates the process. And also, in order to keep more mileage to the process of incentivizing policymakers, we need to adapt the global social progress index to a national social progress index. Why? One reason is that a government administration usually lives for 4 to 6 years in Latin America. And when we use the global social progress index, we use harmonized data by international organizations that is with a lag to 2 to 3 years. So sometimes 3/4 of the administration is already passed. So we need to have a faster way of measuring the government's or society performance from 1 year to another. And that should be like a requirement for if we want to take more mileage on the incentive to policymakers. So that is something very important, and we are in Paraguay in that process. We would like to have in the next few months a social progress index adjusted to our current data that allows us to measure the performance in 2015 in early 2016.
This is critical because something that we are learning in our region in Latin America is the lack of sustainable national policies or national public policies to develop or to obtain benefit of this development. In countries where we are seeing is a national policy, no matter with the administration change every 4 to 6 years, we are seeing the good results. If not, every 4 to 6 years, we are seeing the changes, or something that we saw in the past is public sector waiting, private sector doing something that is not part of our core of business. It's something that are part of the areas that the government must do.
And I think going to that point, how is in Paraguay? What are the plans to be able to ensure that the index is used by subsequent governments? And then I think my other question, kind of along those lines, is, Marcel was talking about resource allocation and that some things are more expensive to do than others, and this is your portfolio. So as you're thinking about Paraguay 2030 and you're thinking about resource allocation, how do you decide between the 12 different components of the index and where you want to be putting state funds?
Yeah. So the first way to nationalize the social progress agenda in Paraguay was to take this contribution in a broader sense of having a national development plan. The Social Progress Index, according to other, in complement with other national initiatives, we come up together with a midterm vision to 2030. That's going to encompass 4 administrations in the country. Mm-hmm. And so we agree on a common vision, on a set of concrete objectives. Actually 72 objectives, 39 are quite straightforward related to the Social Progress Index. And also a structure, the National Strategic Team, which is comprised from government, but also private sector, from civil society and the academia to promote that vision and those policies, and also to engage in a discussion with the monitoring system from results. So that's the way, a midterm, and also in Paraguay, the National Development Plan constitutionally is mandatory from all public sector and indicative for the private sector. Mm-hmm. So we are ensuring a connection of the national budget with that vision and with the monitoring system that are all consistent with the Social Progress Index.
And just looking at public policy, Marcela, how do you see the Social Progress Index results shaping what we mean by development? I mean, have you started to see the results of the index permeating more broadly into the broader development community, or there's obviously successes of the index in countries like Paraguay and Colombia and Brazil, but even more broadly, how are you seeing some of
Well,
this discussion?
I mean, just to respond to what you were saying, this is a very exciting development that I imagine you probably didn't even conceive of when you were thinking about this, that countries would take them internally, domestically, and think about, measuring this at the city level. And just to give a little parenthesis on some research that we've done, how this could be very interesting on the governance level, right? One of our programs, Evidence for Policy Design, did this study in India where it says people don't really vote based on accountability of what your governor has actually done. Yeah. In India, actually, if you have a criminal record, you are likelier to get elected, right? Like in the next election. So there's this disconnect. People, vote for party reasons, for ethnic reasons, and they did a study on a nonprofit showing basically accountability scorecard. Have you built the roads? Have you done X on education? And this kind of very impartial information on what had happened on the previous government made a difference on voting behavior. And I think if at the local level, you're able to have data that is much more interesting than what you're able to gather at the international level. So it being taken on at the local level is a very exciting phenomenon that can change, I think, not only give very concrete goals, but change the way people rate and their government.
Yeah,
and
especially interesting in a region like Latin America where 90% of the population is going to be urbanized by 2030. And so it's really cities that are going to define the future trajectory of the region. Matthew, so we're seeing this at a local level in Paraguay, in Brazil, in Colombia. What about outside, in Latin America, but even beyond? Where are you seeing either currently or on the horizon the social progress index being implemented at a more local level?
Well, I mean, firstly, I think to your last point, one of the most interesting studies that I've seen has been actually in the Brazilian Amazon in the state of Pará, where 144 municipalities all compared each other on a like basis. And what was interesting was that obviously being, the environment being so key to their sense of social well-being and to the outside world's concern about that region, their environmental data was much better than that they all had on a common basis, was much better than some of the stuff we've been able to do at the national level. And so it was a much richer test case of policy differences between different municipalities. So even before you start to get into the urbanization issue, and I would love to get the C40 to be signed up and using this and agreeing common data to allow the world's biggest cities to compare each other. But we're hoping that, Rio has agreed to do a social progress index for the city as part of its Olympic legacy work next summer. So we're going to get an announcement there. As I say, the European Union, it's been very interesting how that they've wanted to sort of ground their regional grant and support policy in more rigorous data and a common framework. And so they just published the other week a first attempt at doing that. And I think we've got high hopes that will actually start to move serious amounts of money within the European Union. So the Columbia Cities Index is going to be. I'm going to be interested to see what the mayor thinks. To your point though, I think what struck me about this is that it's moved so much faster than we would have anticipated in terms of adoption, which I think tells you how profound the demand is now for governments and people running cities to be able to engage with their people. The public's demand for something better than GDP, because the public knows that GDP doesn't really get you very far. It gets you some of the way, but it doesn't get you answers to all the things they are feeling most motivated about. And I think we're very interested in, how quickly can we now engage the academic community more broadly in actually doing those rigorous comparisons of different places that perform, have very different outcomes for the same amount of GDP, so that we can really learn from this. Because I think every year that goes by, the conversation can get a lot richer, and we can really start to learn, what differences are really telling us something important and what's the noise.
I have a couple more questions, then I promise we'll leave a lot of time for questions and answers from the audience, because I assume pretty much most people are here because they're incredibly interested in the topic, and so I'm sure most people actually have questions. But on the city level, Raul, what do you see as the role of, and you can't speak on behalf of the entire business community, but maybe at least on behalf of a company like Abbott, what do you see as the role of the business community insofar as helping to foster the development in cities to be responsive to some of the results that are being seen from the index?
First of all, we are instrumental players of the life at the community level, because we are there, our people is there, our activity is there, so we are impacting what is happening at the community level. Second is, being part of the community, we contribute to different areas. We contribute to promote the transparency and the inclusion of the people. We promote to protect the right of those people. We contribute to education. We contribute in the health arena to develop access. And if the thing is not going well, it's because we are not doing also our advocacy to the authorities to develop the framework that we need to do our activity. What we are not seeing transparency in the interactions within this market. We are part of this. We can discuss and put the rules and influence the rules to have more transparent. When we have inclusion or diversity, respect the diversity with our own employees, we are promoting those employees as a citizens of those community, implement the same behavior in their community. We have the discussion with authorities to promote the labor code or the labor regulatory environment to do the inclusions. When we educate our suppliers in governance and how to do that, how interact, how to discuss the procurement process, we are transfer our knowledge, our governance rules to our agents, and they do the same in the community. When we are paying taxes, and we do in the right way that you must do, we are contributing. So my point here is, the index reflects what is happening in the real life. And the private sector, is part of this. So we have the power to influence. We will need the commitment of the policy decision makers because they will establish the regulatory framework, and they will have the behavior based on the votes that the citizens provide. But we are part of this black box that will provide the solution.
What do you? I have a question for you. And last question. What do you see insofar as the potential, the impediments to the broader development community taking on some of the findings from the index? Obviously, the Inter-American Development Bank is very committed to the SPI and its findings, but I'm sure we don't see that across all development agencies across all countries. And so, what are some of the impediments that you see? And this is something Matthew might want to jump on as well.
It's a good question. I think that the impediment is not because of the index, but because this is hard, right? Both measuring and trying to understand how to move the needle on how to combat poverty, create opportunity. We don't have the answers for many of these, right? So when you create indices, you can have one or two things. So for example, input-based or output-based, right? So we, for example, at the CID have an indicator on the complexity of an economy. We know and have proven that the complexity of an economy can lead to an increase in GDP growth. And then we say, we'll rank you on your complexity, and then you have to figure out how you increase it. Go experiment, let 1,000 flowers bloom, but we can tell you that if you increase the complexity of what you produce, you will grow, okay? And other times, you can say, okay, I know these inputs, and these inputs will get you a better result. So let's go do the inputs, right? The World Economic Forum indicators try to do that, right? Some of those inputs affect growth. Many of them don't. It's a very hard thing to push. So when we have things that are difficult that you're trying to measure around the world, like education, right? We actually very difficult to measure what we're trying to measure. You're trying to measure learning. You're trying to measure quality of education. Those things don't exist. And when they exist maybe at the national level, PISA scores or whatnot. But we don't have an output measure that say, okay, you get this score. you are improving the opportunities of kids that actually go to school. You do the best that you can by measuring enrollment, literacy rates, but there's still inputs, right? So I think the question is, well, if I do all these things, am I actually going to get a better education system and create the opportunities? Well, maybe, I don't know. And have we created an actual theory of change or how we're going to affect learning? So I think the challenge that it presents is one that we have in the development community that gets solved by academics researching, you guys discussing, you guys implementing, and us continuing to answer the question, how do we affect what we're trying to affect, which is quality of education, and what are the inputs that are going to vary by the context? And that's just the nature of trying to move the needle in development.
Yes,
let me provide an example. In Costa Rica, we have a vascular plant, and there is a hub there with not just Abbott, other companies invest to develop these kind of medical devices, but they need to improve the quality of the education of the engineers, of the technicians we have working in the plant. So the government opened to have an interaction to see how they can improve the quality of the education at the university, not just at the university outcome, but also at the technical school, because those are the profiles that need it. And there is the kind of public and private interaction based on the needs to develop, the answer from the government creating the conditions, and articulate the response.
Yeah, and I'm sure, Mr. Milites, these are questions that you're grappling with in Paraguay. How do you effectively measure the outputs of the investments of budgetary investments in these different components versus strictly measuring the inputs?
Yes, I think that what is important is to have a complementary system of measurement. We know that the quality of life is better captured by outcomes. It's not only money spent in education, but what children learn in school. And in that sense, the philosophy that proposed the Social Progress Index is very good one, it's a very useful one. But we also need to make a decision on how to allocate money. So we need to have a theory of what are the best production function to produce those outcomes, and use that at the output level to guide also the allocation of money in the budget. So having a system that monitors inputs, outputs, and outcomes is what we need for policy making.
Okay, I'm sure there are a lot of questions, so if you have a question, please raise your hand and identify yourself. We have people walking around with microphones. And I promise you, if there are no questions from the audience, I have a lot more. But I want to make sure that we're taking time from everybody here. Yes,
Hi,
could you please identify yourself?
Sure, my name is Keith Mantel. Actually, I was a fellow here a few weeks ago through the Atlantic Council. My question is actually, I'm curious, looking at the advisory board for the social progress imperative, I noticed that Hernando de Soto is on that board. And I know he's such a strong advocate for land and property rights. And I'm just curious to see, I'm kind of actually surprised rather that he wasn't more forceful, because that's his big pitch, is land and property rights, that's not represented more on your index, and how you plan to address that in the future.
Thanks, Keith.
Well, I mean, I think he's been a very helpful advisor, as have all the advisory board members. One of the things that, building on the last discussion, that we really argued a lot about and ended up ending up with a very strong conclusion, was that we would be entirely focused on outcomes rather than inputs and so forth. And I think that has influenced the extent to which, we were going to put property ownership and so forth, and property rights as a separate category. I mean, it's clearly part of the opportunity set that we're doing. But the fact that we've gone down the non-economic outputs route doesn't mean that we're not interested in all the questions about what contributes to that. I mean, I'm very passionate about financial inclusion as a cause that I think is very important to development. We are not measuring financial inclusion in the index, but I'm very interested to study how financial inclusion correlates with the social progress measures that we have, because that will tell us, I think, a lot more about what strategies around financial inclusion will work. I think the same will apply for a variety of the issues that Hernando talks about, and I think he would be the first to say, when you push him, that property rights for him are the most visible and most instantly usable economic tools of inclusion, but that he sees it as part of a much broader process of, how do you take people who are excluded and in the informal economy and bring them in a meaningful way into the formal economy, so that you set their all sorts of aspects of their capital, including their human capital and so forth, free. And so, I think in that sense it's a broader toolkit than that. But it is, I think this question of, have we created the right framework of non-economic outputs that sort of broadly allows everyone to be on a common platform, having the same basic agreed framework that they can have a conversation within. I think most people feel this is a good enough start to be very widely adopted, and then everyone's has to kind of take some cognizance of what other countries, other places are doing, how they look, and find these interesting peer groups, and then you can actually start to go much more deeply into what's brought about. Is it the complexity of the economy? Is it the property rights structure? Is it the financial inclusion structure?
I think it's an interesting point as well that you bring up, that I don't think we've talked about this yet, that the index is constantly evolving as well. And so that there's a basic tenets of it that you need to have to make sure that the results are comparable year by year, but that things like financial inclusion and I'm sure a whole host of other issues are ones that you're grappling with insofar as how do you integrate moving forward.
Yeah, and I think this question of formality versus informality, I think, is one that's a very interesting debate at the moment.
Other questions? Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Andrea Muth. I'm here with the Adrian Arsh Latin America Center with the Atlantic Council. I was just curious to know more about the sustainability, the ecosystem sustainability component of the index. One of the major elements of it is greenhouse gas emissions, and I was just curious to see how much is that impacting the lives on the ground in terms of emissions? Is it in absolute terms? Do you take into account the big discussion of developing versus developed countries? And do you think that recent commitments that were made by developing countries as we near the Paris meetings are going to make a big difference in that going forward?
I mean, the sustainability stuff most visibly appears in the foundations of well-being pillar, and the question there we're trying to answer is, does the geographical entity have a environmentally sustainable ecosystem in which a variety of different indicators are being used? I mean, I think we're not as an organisation able to take a position on what they're going to decide in Paris, and to what extent it's fair to burden developing countries with paying for the crimes of the rich world in environmental terms. I mean, I think that's something that is way beyond our ability to say anything useful. I mean, what we can say is, does this country look good or bad on its ecosystem sustainability? And I think there seems to be reasonable data on things like carbon emissions that get us somewhere, and it certainly gets us beyond what's in the Human Development Index historically, and allows some good conversations. But I mean, obviously these are huge topics about global governance that just have to be addressed on a global stage by policy. I think an index like this is never going to be able to answer that sort of complex political negotiation.
And the index, I mean, I think you raised a point, Andrea raised a point about how political the index can be as well. I mean, the fact that countries are looking at their aggregate score, but also their score in certain categories. I'm sure that you've seen that probably generate some pushback at certain points from countries saying, why am I ranked, in the bottom tier? I should be ranked in a middle tier. And I think there's a question, for you, Matthew, but also for Mr. Molinas as well, insofar as have you even seen in Paraguay? Have you seen certain some of your colleagues push back on some of the rankings of the country and say really we don't agree with this, and we don't think Paraguay is doing as poorly in this category, or we think we should be doing better in another category. Have you seen that pushback?
No, not yet.
No, not yet.
Not yet. But that's a possibility indeed. Let me do a comment on the environmental sustainability. If we take the spirit of the SPI, as Matthew was telling us, to go beyond GDP, this is a great improvement. In the sense that it put within the indicators certain things that are measured, and also certain things that are ranking countries and policy, and put on the table for a debate. So I'm sure it still could be an improvement, but it's already a big step from what GDP delivers.
Marcel, did you want to jump in as well?
And no, I mean, I think what you mentioned is true, that these are probably very political processes. Everybody wants to be good at one thing, and there's many indices that get developed for that reason. But I think, and there are people or countries that are going to, study to the test, kind of, to get a higher score, but I think that is not going to be the majority, and it's going to be a small cost to pay as part of doing any indices versus all the serious nations that are going to see this and adopt them at a much deeper level.
Yeah, I think there's enough scope within most countries' potential improvement that they can take various different paths to rise up the index that may reflect their internal political spectrum. I think some countries will, there will be governments at times that are probably more conservative with regard to family values or whatever, or LGBT equality and so forth, that may lag in that area and choose to emphasize other aspects of economic opportunity. And I think it's good that there is scope to reflect both sides or many sides of the political spectrum within each country. Otherwise, you'll get a government use the index and another government come in and throw it out. What we want is a common basis. And I think the other aspect, though, is that it is clear that I think that at some level there is an emerging global consensus around what the good society looks like, and every country, whether conservative or liberal, is increasingly wanting to know where it fits on that spectrum. And the more we can have a constant empirical framework for talking about that, I think the better. I think it will shape politics.
Yeah.
With a more global imprint than it has in the past.
Yeah, and I think that's that's part of the point of this discussion today. Is the index is a tool for potentially catalyzing the broader global development community to rethink how development is traditionally perceived, right? And what is the extent to which this index or other index, the Human Development Index, the Happiness Index, how can all these different tools be used more broadly to rethink the way that I think in many ways we've been stuck in a rut for many years insofar as how we conceptualize what does development really mean? I don't know if anyone wants to comment on that.
And I'd like to remark regarding the sustainability. Private sector here is a driver to link or to move ahead from the different tier, because if we bring the standards that we use in developed market into the market that is would have less capability, and we use worldwide standards, we will help to move ahead and contribute to policy decision maker understand implement the measures necessary. So, and again, what you said, all the index are not perfect. It's just an indicators. Then you need to use those indicators to move into the real life and promote the right policies to make the change happen.
Other questions from the audience, and as you see, as I've threatened, I have plenty more myself. Yes, in the back row.
Hey, my name is Rebecca. In the map that's displayed right now, I guess the 2015 rankings, some of the most interesting countries, complex countries like Democratic Republic of Congo, Papua New Guinea, and in Latin America, Haiti, don't have rankings. They're listed as not applicable. Is that because the countries themselves, the governments decided to opt out of this index because the data is difficult to, aggregate? And how do you plan to include those countries that probably need the index the most?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we're obviously still in the rollout phase. We're in year 3. The first year was only about 50 countries or less, and now we're up to 140. I mean, I think the key is that there's enough data of sufficient reliability that we can compare countries at least roughly on a similar basis. And I think those that have been left out is mostly because we haven't had data that's either timely enough or rigorous enough to feel confident in using them. I think, as I say, I think if you look at, this extraordinary report that came out of the UN in the last, about 6-7 months ago on the data challenges facing the Millennium Development Goals and now the Sustainable Development Goals, and just showing how in very large parts of the world you simply are using either a model or an estimate for the data on whether these goals are being achieved. It tells you how big a challenge the world faces in terms of improving its data collection so that we can actually tell what policies are working and what aren't, and which is why I think this whole one of the potential benefits of what's going on with the shift to smartphones in the developing world over the next few years is that if we think it through now and embed in that technology some kind of strategy for generating publicly useful data in a way that respects the privacy of the individual consumer, I think we could tackle some of those data deficit problems and get much better policy analysis coming out of that. And now is the time to be really working very hard on that, and I hope that the Social Progress Imperative can play some kind of role in that.
I just have a question for you to follow that up, because I think that's very exciting. Right? First, you're putting pressure on the governments that don't produce the data to get into the rankings, but the idea of the public-private partnerships to gather this data, do you have a couple examples of some exciting developments or data points that could give us insight on outcomes that we want to achieve? I'm just thinking, commuting times could be something that we measure, having telephone data, and that's an interesting.
Right.
Well,
this is. I said Washington D.C. wouldn't do too well.
Yeah.
I mean, this is a little tangential, but I mean, obviously the best known example we've had so far is Google's flu trends work, where simply Google discovered that if you use the frequency of searches with words with the word flu or cold or something in, it was a quicker indicator of the outbreaks of flu than anything that was coming out of the WHO or the CDC. And they've done a number of other projects in that area. I've also been fascinated to look, Matt Flannery, who created Kiva, or co-founder of Kiva, the international lending platform. He's now got experimenting with mobile phone-based lending in Kenya, and they just simply made loans available to anyone that applied and looked at the repayment rates, and then they've been doing big data analysis of who's a good credit and who isn't, and it turns out that people with 100 or more Facebook friends were much more reliable in paying things back. And these are entirely new concepts and things that we're able to get a handle on, and the challenge, I think, is to think about are there similar experiments that we could do, or big data insights that we can glean around the sorts of questions we're trying to answer with the Social Progress Index.
Well, it really shows the important role of the private sector insofar as helping to think through some of these data points that traditional measurements of data don't allow us to.
And the private sector is now sitting on vast amounts of data that probably it isn't even thinking about. What are the public useful uses for this data that could actually, and it might not cost very much, particularly if you embed it in the DNA of the technology from the start, that these things are going to be collected automatically I mean, I think there's obviously, you have to address the privacy issues
Yeah,
and the
of course.
cybersecurity questions as well at the same time, which I think make people feel nervous about anything that's going to be released more broadly. But I think that may be part of the solution to that concern, is if you can actually, as the private sector, come out with something where you're really demonstrating how this is benefiting public policy making.
Yes, other concrete example is when governments implement immunization programs and they need a second shot to address the completion of the vaccination. Working together, private and public sector use mobiles network just to send a message and help to address, to complete the scheme of vaccination, and this also addressed to have a greater rate of immunization. This is a good example how we can work together.
Yeah. No, sorry.
Yeah, we have time for one last short question, and then we'll wrap up, please.
Especially for Matthew.
Can you say?
I'm sorry, I'm Raul Gauto from Fundación Avina. Thank you. We see that in Latin America, in Africa, and some other places, ideology and religious fundamentalism is hampering development and social progress. How do you think this new tool, the social progress index, can help us to overcome those issues?
You know, I mean, I think it's. I mean, there's obviously an ongoing dialogue between the religious communities of the world and those that are sort of more secular-driven policy organizations. And I think it's interesting to see the new Pope coming out of Latin America using a different set of emphases in what he says about certain social policies. And I think what we can't really answer that question. As I say, I think we have adopted a framework that is fundamentally based on a broad view of an inclusive view of progress that includes things like we do think that as part of opportunity, empowering women, LGBT equality, so that people can choose how they live their lives, is part of the framework. But as I say, I think within that, you can choose which bits you emphasize as a government or whatever. And some countries are going to say, culturally, we're less likely to pursue certain policies to advance what the Social Progress Index measures than others. And I think what the index can do is expose that more fully when they make those choices, and hopefully, we may get more empirical evidence on whether countries that are, say, very positive about LGBT rights and empowering women, whether their economies, for example, perform better, whether they are less prone to violence, revolution, whatever. I think these are all these sort of empirical questions that over time, as we get a track record on these indices and we can see how policy changes feed through, we're going to be able to get much more rigorous conclusions. And I think, then, as I think has happened a bit with the Catholic Church, when you're making policy or making advocating behaviour that does have an economic price or has a price in terms of how the society functions, maybe you get a feedback from your members that they want to change, and maybe the leadership eventually hears. And maybe if you actually do see, as we've seen in some countries in the Middle East, for example, where they scored very badly on the opportunity level, a number of the countries that then went through the Arab Spring, it seems like that was, to some extent, a leading indicator that they would have problems. Now, it hasn't been a leading indicator that they would find solutions to those problems that worked. So that's another whole other set of questions. But if you're a leader of an organization that is espousing a set of positions, and we can shed some light on whether those policies are likely to be sustainable in terms of being popular with the people of your country, that's probably a useful piece of information.
I think, Matthew, I think we could probably now, with that question, we could probably be here for another hour on this point. So, but in the interest of time, I want to please join me again, and please join me in thanking the panelists, and again, thanking Julie Katzman for her excellent introductory remarks. And I'd like to as well thank the Skull Foundation again for their support of this event, and Maria Fernanda Perez in the first row here, who really is the one who put together this entire event. So thank you, Maria Fernanda, and thank you everyone for being here with us today.